Now on to this developing story we're tracking for you this afternoon. Tourism and transport ministers, together with US Embassy representatives and the CEO of airports company South Africa, are at OR Tambo International Airport to welcome the arrival of United Airlines' first scheduled daily flight between New York and Johannesburg. Now the move comes amid tight travel restrictions imposed by US on South African travellers following a second wave of COVID-19 infections and the discovery of a new variant in the country. Now let's get the very latest. We now go to our reporter Naledi Ngcobo, who is at OR Tambo International Airport. Well, judging just by the delegation, Naledi, I take it that this is a very important occasion, not only for tourism, but also for the said airline. Talk to us about what time the flight is expected to touch down and what's expected to happen there this afternoon.
Well, good afternoon, or rather maybe good evening, Unati. We're here at OR Tambo Airport, where we're expecting around 243 passengers traveling from the US to arrive here in South Africa on the very first ever United Airlines flight, which is traveling the route from Johannesburg, between Johannesburg as well as New York. We understand that our guests or travelers are going to be arriving at around 5:45 this evening. And of course, we're expecting Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula as well as Tourism Minister Ngubani to also be here for the arrival. And once we're here, we'll certainly hear what the airline expects to come out of this initiative. We understand that the airline hopes that this will build business relations between South Africa as well as America. We do understand that this is happening at a time where there's heightened restrictions for South Africa to travel to the US. But of course, we understand that many Americans at this point have received their vaccinations. Around 40% of their population has received vaccinations and therefore are free to travel to South Africa. So it will be interesting to hear from the ministers here today arriving, that we expect to arrive today, about what it is that South Africans can expect from this flight and how it will boost tourism numbers for South Africa.
Naledi, I hope I heard you correctly, but because of the funfair that's happening there with the noise, I know that the passengers who traveled from New York City last night were also, I think, given a farewell, as we've seen in that piece by our colleague in New York City, Sherwin Bryce piece. But perhaps let's talk about those logistics. We know that the US had imposed a number of restrictions on South Africans traveling to that country as well. What are the logistics in terms of the passengers? I heard you say that some of them got vaccinated. Are there any requirements from the South African government that when they land, they should then self-isolate, etc.?
Well, at this point, we do understand that there aren't really any requirements from the South African governments for these travelers. And we do understand that going back to the US, they will not necessarily be, required to quarantine as we've seen in the past, because most of the passengers had received their vaccinations. We know that the vaccine rollout, however, here in South Africa is quite slow. And there are some restrictions, but also there's some exemptions that South Africans have been given in order to travel to the US. We do understand that travelers from South Africa will have to travel under what is called the National Interest Exemption Protocol, which has been imposed by the US, meaning only a select number of South Africans can actually travel to the US. And those are the ones that are considered to be serving of an interest to the US. I understand people like journalists as well as healthcare professionals, as academics and students will be allowed to travel to the US. And we'll obviously hear once there has been a vaccination what other requirements there will be for South Africans to travel.
Now, talk to us about today's proceedings. You mentioned several delegates, high-profile delegates for that matter, that will be there in attendance, for obviously this momentous occasion for South Africa, I would imagine. Have you at all had an opportunity to speak to airport authorities in terms of how they are facilitating other flights from other destinations?
point, we really haven't been able to speak to anyone. Of course, you would understand that there's, some protocols, strict protocols that we'd need to adhere to in terms of COVID, in terms of who we get to speak to and accessibility of people at this point. But we do understand that the CEO of Airport South Africa, Ms. Mpumi Mpofu, is going to be here today welcoming these guests. She's also going to be joined by some U.S. diplomats as well from the U.S. Embassy here in South Africa, who are also going to be joining the ministerial delegation, who is going to be welcoming some of the travelers that are actually expected to arrive here today.
All right, Naledi, I think let's leave it for now there this afternoon. I know that you will be bringing us, obviously, coverage later on the channel. That was Naledi Ngcobo, our reporter, who is at OR Tambo International Airport this afternoon, where several delegations, including tourism and transport ministers, as well as the U.S. Embassy, are expected together there to welcome that first direct flight from New York City to Johannesburg. Well,